You're watching The Bridge, sponsored by Novum, providing solutions for a new generation. In today's world, it's never been more important for the government agencies and the businesses that serve them to find new solutions to the many issues facing our country. The Bridge is the only television program devoted exclusively to bridging the gap between today's government and the private business sector. Welcome to The Bridge.
Hello, I'm Jim McCarthy, your host of The Bridge. Each week we explore how to bridge the gap between today's government and the private sector. Today I'll speak with Jeffrey Higgins, a retired DEA special agent. He's going to explain that narco-terrorism doesn't only make for suspenseful books and movies, but also has a direct impact on vital services needed from the private sector. My next guest is Jeffrey James Higgins. Jeff is a retired DEA Supervisory Special Agent. He has over 25 years of law enforcement experience, and he's an expert in narco-terrorism. He's been deployed around the world with DEA's tactical teams. He's worked with the U.S. and foreign law enforcement, military, and special forces, and the intelligence services. So we're going to talk about some gaps right now between the government and the private sector in this area of narco-terrorism and how those gaps could be filled. So first question, how about defining for us what we mean by narco-terrorism?
Well, there are a few different definitions for it. There's the traditional narco-terrorism, which is more narcotics trafficking groups that are using terrorism as a way to further their business. So think of this as like the Pablo Escobar, Medellin cartel kind of narco-terrorism, where they're basically targeting judges, threatening prosecutors, trying to destabilize the government to further their own business. Right. That was the traditional model. But post 9/11, we're looking at something a lot different.
It kind of flipped?
Well, it still includes that. I mean, the way now it's more of a generalized definition of narco-terrorism. It's in any nexus between terrorism and narcotics, people call narco-terrorism. I think it's generally 3 or 4 different types. I could say 3 with a 3A. Like there's the traditional type where you have the narcotics trafficking group that's engaging in terrorist activities to further their business. Then you have terrorist groups that are ideologically motivated terrorist groups that engage in narcotics trafficking as a means to generate funds so they can finance their operations. And then, the second, an example of that, but a bigger, broader one, are groups that engage in both terrorism and narcotics equally. And the first narco-terrorism case was actually against a group that did that. They were both opium traffickers and heroin traffickers and ideologically motivated.
What about, since this show is called The Bridge and we're bridging gaps, what are some gaps that you think exist in the current world of narco-terrorism?
I think there are a lot of gaps. So narco-terrorism, I mentioned the traditional model. Now they're looking at any way that narcotics are actually associated with terrorism. So terrorism is being funded by narcotics all over the world. And so because people are spending more time and more focus now on narco-terrorism, I think there's a huge opportunity for the private sector to get involved in certain areas like training, when you're talking about foreign police and foreign narco trafficking, and the intelligence and the police and the military and even the state
that represents the gaps as well.
Right. So there's huge gaps there. In training and logistics, in operational support, in a variety of ways.
Is it now become synonymous that what used to be called anyway, the war on terror, is really a war on global trafficking? Does that make sense? Sure. Are they the same? Are they the same thing?
They're not the same, but they're inextricably tied to each other.
Linked, yeah.
So you have these linkages on all different levels, but it's really impossible to go after terrorism without also paying attention to the funding of terrorism, and the funding of terrorism is directly tied to narcotics.
One of the things that intrigued me about your background was your experience in Afghanistan. I obviously, I know there's certain things that you can't talk about publicly or whatever like that, but I guess my thought was that at one point the Taliban had actually done a pretty good job of eradicating the opium and poppy business, and yet it seems to have come back with a vengeance. It's now flourishing. Is that a correct observation on my part?
It's commonly repeated. I believe it's somewhat of a myth.
How so?
Within Islamic jurisprudence, there's no absolute obligation not to engage in narcotics trafficking. Occasionally you'll hear that people who are ideologically motivated under Islam don't want to engage in narcotics, but there's nothing that prohibits them from doing that. So the Taliban themselves did, under the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, benefit from narcotics. And when they outlawed it, a lot of people believe it was outlawed more to drive up prices because they didn't destroy stores of opium. They didn't just destroy years worth of heroin, which had been processed and stored. And now the Taliban, and for many years, the Taliban's been actively engaged in heroin trafficking.
I see. Well, in terms of Afghanistan, when you were over there, basically, how would you characterize this? Would you be able to walk down the street and feel safe? I mean, you know, were you
Safe
able
in
to
Afghanistan?
Yes.
No. I mean,
No.
there's no rule of law, or very little rule of law.
Yeah.
And there's been periods of time when things were a little safer, when the coalition forces were making gains against the Taliban.
Yeah.
But like right now, it's extremely dangerous outside of Kabul, and even in Kabul. I mean, just this last week, there was a major bombing attack.
Yeah.
You know, I think there were 80
some?
Yeah, a lot of people killed.
Are we winning the war against narco-terrorism?
I don't know if it's something that's winnable. I think it's something that you can manage, like all kinds of crimes. You know, you can't defeat murder. Murder's always going to exist. I think narcotics will always exist. They always have. People always look for substances to make their daily lives or escape the sorrow of their daily lives. So, are we winning? You know, if the prices are falling on narcotics worldwide, and if they're more accessible than they have been, then I would say no. Those are metrics that show that you're not winning.
Well, it sounds like we'll take winning however we can get it, but that it's an uphill battle for sure. All right, well, Jeffrey, listen, thank you so much for being here today. Your insight is invaluable, and it's impossible to bridge the gap between the government and the private sector without constant innovation on both sides. To that end, I want to thank our panel for today's conversation. My thanks go earlier to Jake Bittner, the CEO of Clarion, Monica McEwen, who is the Vice President at Click, and Dan Levinson, the Digital Service Contracting Officer at the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare. I also want to thank you, Jeff Higgins, for being on the show here. We thought it was very interesting. It's a topic that we want to explore in its own show, by the way, sometime in the future, okay?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So anyway, many thanks to the men and women of our technical team for their vital contributions to today's show. Please remember that you can visit us online at thebridgeontv.com, and there you'll see all our episodes streamed and can share your questions, your comments, and your suggestions. And while there, don't forget to check out the latest update of our very own Bridge Gap Index. And now, most importantly, thank you for taking the time from your busy schedule to watch The Bridge. We will see you next week or anytime on thebridgeontv.com. And on behalf of all my colleagues for The Bridge, I'm Jim McCarthy.